references have been made several times to the embargo slash blockade. Could you talk about, Jen, maybe you can start talk about your lived experience of the embargo while you were there? What did you see? What did you...
You know, I'm not sure I can. I kept trying to figure out what the lived experience of the embargo was. I'd heard stuff about it, but I didn't actually live any of it. Maybe someone else can start talking and I'll jump in if I think of something. I know we kept sort of trying to figure out what there were shortages of and what the embargo might be blocking besides large numbers of Americans coming in. But otherwise, I didn't see it to a large degree. Everywhere we were, everything seemed to be in sort of large supply. That I didn't notice any shortages, but I'm sure they're there. But other people might have.
I think from a telecommunications perspective, is probably the most obvious without having those relationships. I mean, the internet was available, but you know, phones were kind of available, but I mean, it was extremely expensive to make calls, and your cell phones didn't work at all.
Now, is that the embargo, or is that government regulations?
I think
or some comments.
I guess they're sort of both of the same things, I guess, because there's no sort of agreements with Cuba, with American-based telecommunication systems, that there would be a total blackout on the island, so that there was Cuban cell phones that must have been managed through some other satellite. I guess probably Chinese satellite, but I mean, I don't know. But that was the first thing that struck me, is that the telecommunications almost total blackout from our perspective, which was nice in a way, because it forced us not to have to, you know, be on the phones and texting and things like that. But at the same time, it was a little bit strange because we live in this sort of hyper-information technology society. But the link between, I think, for their sort of idea between the embargo and the blockade is that there's a certain percentage of materials in products that are not allowed in, and I think that, like, what is it, 10 or 20%?
10%. Yeah.
So if anything has any sort of U.S. ownership or U.S. patent technology, if it's more than 10%, then it's not allowed in. So you won't see some basic stuff there, like iPhones and things like that, just don't exist on the island. And since most of us have those sorts of phones, you know, it's sort of that's the first thing. But you know, a lot of their products are sort of, they're branded either Cuban or clearly something somewhat unrecognizable for us, because they would be from somewhere else. But it makes it, I think the message from them is that even things that would be manufactured in China would rely on U.S. technology. So some of the things aren't allowed to be imported into the island because of that. Or the story with the hotels, that if the Cuban nationals go to third-party countries and have hotels whose ownership is of a significant percentage of American investors, or whose headquarters happens to be in the United States, then technically they're not allowed to stay at those hotels, and they have been kicked out of them. So that's sort of a, you know, it's sort of a real thing for them.
Yeah, I got more and more confused about the embargo the longer we were there. We sort of did this thing when we were there, that we would sort of look at the products that were, like the condiments that were given to us at restaurants, and say, well, that's an American company. How did that get there? And Pam, our sort of one of the trip organizers, would say, well, and then she'd go into the long explanation about why that product was okay. And so yes, there's this 10% rule, but then there's exceptions for certain agricultural products, but those are very complex. And then there's other kinds of exceptions for other kinds of products. So it's not that the blockade / embargo is not straightforward. It's riddled with all kinds of complexities that I feel very confused about right now, and would love to unravel a little bit more and understand a little bit better. But also kind of riddled with all kinds of economic arrangements, and you sort of get the sense that at some point someone probably worked out a sort of favorable business arrangement and managed to get an exception to the blockade. In another case where it makes absolutely no economic sense and it's not going to hurt anyone, they do it just to kind of hurt someone and just to kind of remind the other about that, or the U.S. remind Cuba about that power. So it's a very complicated kind of political economic thing that's not as straightforward as I thought it was, and I wish I understood it better.
Right, so this is the problem of trying to isolate a country in a globalized world, right? So, I mean, the lived embargo, I was only there for a few days, so I wouldn't claim to kind of be fully appreciative of its impact. But certainly as a tourist, not being able to use your credit card. So for us as a group, we actually had to take in cash everything that we needed. So when you were there, you couldn't hit an ATM machine, you couldn't do anything like that. And I think that's probably, certainly for Americans, that's got to be the biggest impediment. It would seem like building supplies were probably much scarcer than than they should have been. If you had complete free flow of goods and services, probably Old Havana and some of the areas along the Malecón would have been shiny and ready for tourists, regardless of expectations. The transportation sector. So I mean, certainly one of the stereotypical images I think of Cuba is all of these 1950s American cars, because that's right. 50s and maybe the early 60s when they kind of cut this off. So all of these cars are driving around. The exteriors are beautiful for the most part, not all of them, but the interiors have been cobbled together, the mechanics, the interior stuff. And then you get these Korean cars and Chinese cars, and the public sector seem to have these Chinese buses that were few and far between, very overpacked, and prone to breakdown, I think. So I think those are the sectors, in addition to what Chris was mentioning. I think they're significantly impacted.